Thank you so much for watching this message from our Young Adults Ministry here at Reston Bible Church. My name is David Wright, and I'm one of the pastors here at RBC and get to oversee this wonderful ministry. To know more about young adults, please follow us on Instagram at Reston Bible YA. Enjoy the message. Well, young adults, it's a great privilege to be able to conduct this interview with a mentor, a former professor, and a friend, Dr. Richard Smith. Dr. Smith has been someone who's been so impactful to my life in a variety of ways. I first met him when I was a student at Taylor University. Our first interaction was planning and ultimately going to Israel together, where that trip changed my life radically, and I got to experience that with Dr. Smith. So, Dr. Smith, thanks so much for being here with us. And why don't you just share a little bit about yourself, starting with what your life was like growing up, and kind of how you got into academia.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for having me. I consider it a great privilege. And but yeah, I'm originally from Arkansas, and I grew up on two sides of a cultural fence, I guess you might say. My father was a research professor of biochemistry at the University of Arkansas Medical School, so kind of had that whole academic or at least scientific thing going. And then we also had a family farm that my grandfather lived on and that I grew up on that I considered home. And so I spent my time raising hogs and, running cattle and, hunting in the woods and all that kind of stuff. So I kind of had that background. Uh, but yeah, I went to parochial schools actually uh, for all my education up through high school. And in junior high I played football, and I played football in high school, and you know got active in my church youth group later in high school. So all pretty normal kind of stuff, I guess you might say.
Played football at Arkansas as well.
I walked on and I was on the team, but that was about it. I was not any good. I have no shame in admitting that.
I don't know if you can not be any good playing at Arkansas, but that's beside the point. Out of college, you did a little bit of a program at Kanakuk, if I remember correctly, and then ultimately you decided to go into academia. So tell us a little bit about kind of your academic credentials and your journey in your own studies.
Yeah, well, I graduated from the University of Arkansas with a degree in animal sciences, and but just felt the Lord's call in my life that really wasn't where He wanted me to go. And I'd been grappling with a call to ministry really ever since high school. And so went and did a discipleship program after college, up in Branson, Missouri, to kind of help me sort that out. um, Decided after that God was going to have to really make me even more convicted and sure that He wanted me to go into ministry. you know, uh, but eventually He did, and so I went and did a pastoral internship for a year at the church I'd been involved in college up in Northwest Arkansas, and then from there I made the decision to get seminary training. But that was all driven by a call to ministry, and that gradually kind of took shape. Uh, and at the end of my pastoral internship, I felt like the Lord was calling me to some ministry function of teaching. Okay, so that really drove the decision about going to seminary and getting that kind of training. And by the time I was nearing the end of seminary, it started to actually then was kind of looking like maybe an academic ministry might fit well. So the academic aspect was kind of a long time coming. It wasn't what I started out looking to. And so that set up decisions about getting, really advanced training and getting a doctorate. I went to the University of Cambridge to do that. And so, yeah, that's kind of the academic credentials road, in ministry. And of course, after Cambridge, I came here to Taylor University 23 years ago, and I've been here ever since.
That's amazing. And you've been there coming up on 2.5 decades, real shortly here. Tell us a little bit about the types of classes you teach and your specialty within the Old Testament.
Yeah, well, I teach in the Biblical Studies division, and regularly teach an Old Testament survey course just about every semester. Uh, Occasionally, I do the same thing with a New Testament course. For about 20 some odd years, I taught a course on the poetic and wisdom literature explicitly, Proverbs, Job, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Psalms. Um, I'm recently picking up, a course on the prophets, and then for years I've taught the capstone course for all the biblical studies majors, all the seniors. So that's kind of my regular load and what I teach. The wisdom literature um, and wisdom thought in general in the Old Testament has kind of been, I guess, a specialization. It crosses a lot of genres. It involves the prophets. It involves law, Pentateuch, historical narrative, all that sort of stuff. Eventually, um, and that was really, yeah, working of my own personal interest in that uh, part of the Bible because I had come to depend on it so much earlier in life. And in fact, the wisdom literature, I would say, even saved my life, kept me from succumbing to in during various trials and kept me between the ditches, so
You know,
um,
one of the things that I've appreciated about you, that I hope even just shines through in our conversation is this stuff isn't relegated to the realm of ideas for you. This is
no,
intensely practical and intensely spiritual and intensely related to your own discipleship. Even just, you saying academia wasn't the form that I set out. The call was to ministry, the call was to serve. Um,
mm,
and you serve through your academic work and teaching. And I've appreciated that about you for a long time.
yeah.
Um,
I had some good mentors and early on who encouraged me to really think in terms of my ministry function before I started thinking about what form that ministry would take. And academia is a form, teaching as a function, scholarships even a function. And God could call me to go do that anywhere. It just kind of became a wisdom decision, given, that decided that maybe academia would give me the structure I needed in order to, discharge my function. So that's kind of how it all came about, I guess.
yeah. Well, let's get into Ecclesiastes here because you've spent, decades in this material. This material has just been your bread and butter. And I remember I had that poetic wisdom class with you, which made a huge impact on me. And, before we get to Ecclesiastes, Dr. Smith, it's hard for us to even approach it properly because, Ecclesiastes is like the person who throws a bucket of cold water on a drunkard, trying to sober them up.
Yeah.
We don't want to really deal with Ecclesiastes because Ecclesiastes, frankly, paints a picture of the world that is pretty thoroughly depressing
Mhm.
and something that goes against every optimistic fiber in our being. And so, from your perspective, before we even get to the material of Ecclesiastes, why is it so hard for us to even deal rightly with Kohelet, the preacher figure, and what he has to say about the way the world is?
Well, I guess because what Kohelet has to say about the world makes us feel incredibly insecure and vulnerable. And we don't like feeling that way. Okay. Um, Kohelet, kind of a wrecking ball, in some respects. He's tearing down a lot of things in order that he can build some more basic things up. But yeah, it flies in the face of how we want to look at the world and look at ourselves. And again, just makes us feel insecure and vulnerable. And we tend to think that that's bad. And so we then, both individually as individual people in our lives, but also as societies, or communities, we oftentimes, and spend a lot of time basically creating all sorts of ways to avoid having to face the cold, hard realities that Kohelet claims are right under our nose. And so we come up with various anesthetics to blunt the pain or make it go away, or we come up with various buffers that we use to put us or put what we think is some distance between us and the hardcore reality of a life that's extremely uncooperative, you know. Uh, and so, I mean, we can talk about, what some of those actual things are. Is that what you want
Yeah.
to do?
Especially I think in our technological age, I mean, there's always anesthetics, but in our technological age, I feel like they have just multiplied. Yeah, tell us what are some of these, you use the word anesthetics. What are some of these anesthetics, these distractions that prevent us from dealing with the world as it really is?
Yeah, well, basically, anesthetics are painkillers. And so, the most obvious ones that come to mind is, alcohol, drugs, food, various things that'll basically give us some sort of chemical override, to not face reality, get drunk, get high, euphoric on tryptophan, I suppose, or whatever. But so that's kind of obvious. But, or we might get into, ways of just trying to avoid reality by getting sucked into video games or various kinds of really intense experiences or extreme sorts of undertakings, gambling, or extreme sports and adventures and things like that, basically high risk taking, which again, we look to kind of make us feel alive and kind of avoid the mundane, uh, sort of pain and things that come with worldly existence. Uh, there's social anesthetics too. We'll virtue signal, or we'll emotionally fuse with groups and stuff. But basically, what we're doing is we're looking to other people to tell us who we are, give us a sense of self. You know, Psychologists will call that a reflected sense of self, and you know in the midst of doing that, we can end up confusing our quest to acquire a reputation for being wise with the quest for wisdom itself. And that's a real killer.
Hmm.
Right? Um, you know, you can see that at work even in the Pharisees and the Gospels, but it's a kind of virtue signaling. And, and isn't that what's most important is, how people view us rather than what we're really like.
Yeah.
And then you can get into other anesthetics or buffers that we may use as alternate realities or identities, and some of these are all the rage now, but sometimes they can just be a basic Pollyanna sort of thinking, like everything is awesome, everything is happy,
Like a
you know,
movie. Yeah.
yeah. Or you can just get sucked into a whole cyber world, some sort of alternate reality where you spend all your time, or fantasy or things like that. Uh, or your very identity, you could try to escape from who you are by deciding that you're a different gender and becoming a different gender. So transgenderism is a manifestation of this sort of thing, I would argue. There's other things that go into that. Or maybe you decide to become a furry. But basically these are all ways to avoid the pain of dealing with who you really are
Hmm.
and what the world
Wow.
around you is really like. So yeah, we could go on and on about that,
No
but those are,
doubt. Thinking through my work with young adult men often who are, addicted to pornography, playing tons and tons of video games. Many work from home, and so they're kind of isolated from the world as it really is. But yeah, I mean, it's hard because Kohelet, again, he is throwing that bucket of ice water on you and making you deal with it. Um,
yeah, and he's basically calling you to, or all of us, to a higher level of self-awareness. The world as it really is, and we as we really are. the thought of that has a way of raising a lot of anxiety in us. And rather than acknowledge that anxiety and try to deal with it, we just are more kind of instinctually aware of that anxiety. And so we just try to pacify it, in various ways. You know, porn, of course, we associate that with lust and things like that. But what's driving the whole lust? You're basically trying to get drunk on that in order to avoid dealing with something that's really got you anxious, you know.
And that goes into the theme that Kohelet talks about, a lot, and is kind of resignation to the world as it is. There's this theme of the value of wisdom starts with sort of resigning yourself to accepting things as they really are. Um,
Yeah.
and, Kohelet's not after, he's not a nihilist, right? He's not after that we walk away in total despair, that the world has nothing to offer us because it's just complete absurdity. Kohelet, he has a very high tolerance for the absurdity of the world, but he also has a really high value of wisdom. And this
Mm.
is interesting because I think oftentimes we think of wisdom as a tool for me to sort of get what I want. We see the world as raw material that if I'm wise enough, I can sort of mold the world, craft the world around me to serve my own needs. And yet that's not what Kohelet thinks is the value of wisdom. So I'd love to hear, Dr. Smith, from your perspective, what is the value of wisdom in Kohelet's mind in a world that is absurd and that is often uncontrollable?
Right. Well, yeah, Kohelet. I mean, he's writing to an audience that doesn't need to be convinced that wisdom is important or that wisdom there's tremendous power. They seem to be all on board about that. Okay. What Kohelet's really addressing is how they've kind of fallen prey, or they have fallen into the error of thinking that wisdom is more powerful than it really is, or that wisdom promises things that it really doesn't. I mean, they think that if they just get enough wisdom, then they'll eventually understand, all of ultimate reality. And wisdom was never intended for that purpose. And that wisdom is granted by God, but it was never given for the purpose of being able to put us in control of everything, you know. And Kohelet would argue, kind of paradoxically, I suppose, that it's wise to recognize wisdom's limits. It's foolish to get confused or misconstrue what it is that wisdom actually has to offer. And a life devoid of suffering, a life devoid of existential angst, a life devoid of any confusion or a life that isn't plagued by not knowing. None of those are options.
Mm.
There's no way to avoid any of those things. So hella, he's anchored in, shall we say, a Genesis, 3, version of the world that we tend to get away from because we think we're so much more sophisticated. We don't think that we're really, that tied to, toiling with the ground because, between our office desk and the farmland is a whole supermarket and a whole industry and stuff like that. So we think we're far removed from that stuff when in reality, if it stops raining, uh, eventually we're going to feel that pain. You know, the farmers may feel it first, but it's going to work its way up to us. So we got these buffers between us and these harsh realities, but um, they kind of create more of an illusion uh, about our vulnerability in this world. And so uh, Kohelet wants us to have a proper view of wisdom, and wisdom is good for some things, but it's not going to spare you suffering in this life. It's not going to spare you having to experience injustice. It's not going to spare you any of the things that he associates with the Hevel, or the absurdity of existence and stuff like that. Those are givens. There's nothing you're going to be able to do about it. The whole wisdom enterprise in the Bible, I would argue, is out to make us into more competent sufferers and also into more competent followers, you know, who are discerning and know how to pursue proper allegiances. There's a lot going on there, all right? And it all begins basically with recognizing that wisdom is something, or the pursuit of wisdom, it's not a hobby or some recreational activity. It's serious business, and there's things really at stake in it. Okay. So your entrance into the whole pursuit of wisdom recognizes this. So your pursuit of wisdom begins and honestly continues on a rather somber note. All right. Because it begins with your recognition that, whoa, I'm vulnerable to things in this world. Some of them I can't avoid. Some of them I can avoid. Which is which? You're asking a wisdom question there. Right? And then, okay, well, how should I live that'll give me the best chance of perhaps avoiding this, at least being able to manage this that I can't avoid, and cope with it. All right. Um, so wisdom itself, when you understand it in those terms, that just is another aspect of Kohelet that is kind of disenchanting for us. We like to think of wisdom as, a real power trip and all of that. But it's not. It's essential, and Kohelet sees value in it. I mean, it's better to be wise than it is to be foolish. You're signing up for a lot of unnecessary pain there. Without wisdom, you're not going to be able to recognize the little good things in this life that God gives in the midst of all of this unpleasantness.
Yeah, and we're gonna get there. I want to talk through that because Kohelet has a high view of, appreciating the gifts that God has given in the present. But as we kind of get there, I want to talk a little bit about the intersection between suffering and joy in Kohelet's mind. Because when it comes to false views of wisdom, or even, I guess in this case, a false view of joy, we think of wisdom as the mechanism to attain joy and avoid suffering, which there's some level of truth in that, generally speaking, at least avoiding the suffering that we can control. But help us understand in Kohelet's mind, what is the intersection between a robust theology of the suffering of this world and the joys that we can find in this world, and where do they overlap?
Well, I tend to sum it up like this, and then I'll try to unpack it. But your whole theology of joy is not going to soar any higher than your theology of suffering is deep. Your theology of joy is going to be no more profound than your theology of suffering is profound. Okay. A guy who's been in a concentration camp for several years, okay, gets out of concentration camp and eats a T-bone after having lived on dead rats. Okay. Man, there's a guy who's going to have a profound appreciation for a good T-bone steak. Okay. And that's going to be a source of tremendous joy for him. And he will not take it for granted either. In fact, he'll generate great wisdom about the joys of T-bone steaks, on the basis of that experience. Okay. Uh, well, why is he that way? Why does that happen? What's directly related to what he's had to process regarding suffering? That would be kind of a illustration, I guess, of depth of suffering or depth of reflection on suffering, or a profoundness of your theology of suffering is directly related to how deep your theology of joy is. If you look in the Old Testament, wisdom doesn't always seem to be wise, at first glance. Okay. Um, like when Solomon, told them, well, cut the baby in two, we'll divide it. That didn't sound very wise to anybody, but that's because they didn't understand what he was going for, in terms of smoking out the mother. So wisdom can be a bit, can run under the radar, and seem not very profound when in fact it really is. And there's a price to be paid, in terms of the theology of joy and suffering. I would argue you can't really have one without the other. I was talking with a pastor not long ago who was talking about how their church, is all about joy, okay, and all of that. And I began to probe, about what kind of theology of suffering he had. And it kind of became apparent that he really didn't have much of a theology of suffering. Neither did Job's friends. The price of not having a profound theology of suffering is, you sacrifice a really deep theology of joy. And in the midst of all that, then you set yourself up to be a poor judge of character, kind of like Job's three friends. A world without any hevel in it is a world where there's no such thing as unjust suffering. All suffering is deserved, and there's no such thing as innocent suffering. Okay. At the very least, you're a sinner, so therefore, anything bad that happens to you, you deserve it. Okay. If you're prepared to embrace and acknowledge Kohelet's awareness of the Hevel, a world that is absurd, and the causal relationship between things is oftentimes not discernible. You don't know how things are going to work out, and all of that. Then your categories get broadened and deepened, and you get in a better position to recognize extreme integrity, like Job was not perfect, but he had more integrity than his three friends, quite frankly, could even possibly imagine. And at a corporate level, if there's one thing we don't need, it's a church and church leaders who are not very good judges of character, because that's how we end up with, quite frankly, some of the problems that we all know we have in churches a lot of times.
Super helpful. I think, especially for young adults, like there's the kind of aspect, especially young adults in their 20s, like this is the last generation of youth, wring out every last drop of joy because life is going to be X, Y, and Z later on. I think it's good for Kohelet to sort of shake us into, no, look, great joy can be had in appreciating the gifts and the present that God has given you. But it's only once you sort of reflect on the amount of suffering that you're surrounded by. Like you're in a world of suffering. You're in a world of hevel and absurdity. And it may come to your doorstep because of decisions that you made, and it may just come to your doorstep because of indiscernible reasons. Appreciate when the gifts come to your doorstep is so crucial.
If you think wisdom is basically going to give you a lock on ultimate reality and enable you to figure everything out, well, you're going to be predicating everything you do on some preconceived notion of outcomes. Then when it doesn't work, well, you're going to have to do one of two things. You're either going to kind of fall into despair and depression because life is not working out the way you thought it was, or you're going to have to gin yourself up and create some sort of alternate reality in your head to claim that this is the way it ought to work out. And both of those things divorce you from reality, and both of those things make you unable to see the good things, beautiful things that God has given and does stand ready to give in this life, rather than you predicating all your satisfaction in this life with your ability to change the world. It's probably not going to happen.
Mm.
You know,
So let's end here because I want to really drive this point home, but sometimes hearing sort of personal reflections and stories is a great way to do that. And Dr. Smith, without getting too much into it, I know your own story and your own testimony is one filled with
yep.
suffering. You started out this interview, right, saying the wisdom literature literally saved my life. So I'm curious from your end, how have you seen this principle of your theology of joy will only soar as high as your theology of suffering runs deep play out in your own ability to appreciate what God has given you in the present?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to my own story, I'm always kind of confronted with that feeling. What do you do when your own story is so dark that you just can't tell it? Or there's really no such thing as an appropriate venue, to tell it. And I know I'm not the only one, who has that experience. Oftentimes there's the nice standard paradigms, suffering stories that get delivered from. For me, it was a decades long experience of a really bad relationship. You a person who, in a very narcissistic fashion, tried to destroy everything about me, and launched a campaign to ruin all my friendships and all my professional relationships, and I just ended up losing everything. I remember during the years, oh, I remember I could feel the pressure was so great, and I was afraid that there was a potential that this stress could cause me to trip offline and go act out and pursue some anesthetic, and I didn't want to do that. And I credit the wisdom literature to giving me the presence of mind to even know that that was something I was being threatened with. And so just that in and of itself was a deliverance of sorts. I just steeped myself even deeper, particularly in Job and Ecclesiastes. Eventually, you have to be concerned about who you are, who you really are, and your own integrity before God. What anybody else thinks kind of doesn't matter. Like wild animals out there on the wasteland in the book of Job, we look at them from our domesticated little villages and think, oh, poor animal eking out his existence out there. But in Job, God looks at those animals as critters that they're rugged and very strong because he has made them that way. Despite what humans may think of them, they have no desire to go back to the village and be domesticated and get hitched up to a wagon, even though to us they look like they're utterly wild, rugged animals. They know more about God's extreme, personal, individualized care of them than anybody who lives in town does. Well, I guess I can say, yeah, I've experienced that. That brings a joy that, from my perspective, I mean, is so peaceful and so deep that I still don't know that I can put it into words. It would take an entire exposition of the book of Job for me to put, rhetorical flesh on it, I suppose. And we don't have time for all of that. You want to start living life in color, dealing with your own suffering in a competent way before God, not in an unpainful way. And I don't mean that, but dealing with it with essentially integrity before God. You'll experience it there, man. Some of that color may be your own blood, but it beats the black and white, shallow existence that comes from never having known those things.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
if you think about actually Kohelet, he's getting down to bare bones existence. Well, go look at the Lord's Prayer. What does he emphasize there? What does Jesus emphasize in the Lord's Prayer? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. He emphasizes God's extreme transcendence.
yeah.
So to tell it, okay? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Okay? There's a focus on divine purposes. Give us this day our daily bread. Talk about getting down to basics and little things.
Hmm.
And forgive us our debts or our trespasses. We forgive those who trespass against it. There's a recognition of recognizing that there are things in this life that are contingent. Our own experience of God's forgiveness is related to our willingness to forgive others. A fundamental contingency in life that there, whether we like it or not. Kohelet's into acknowledging there are contingencies. You can't do everything, and some things are dependent on other things. Okay, lead us not into temptation, deliver us from evil. Ethics still matters, and there's a forward look, a hope that God will see us through. So all those things, they're just encapsulated in the Lord's Prayer. Those bare bones concerns pretty much already reflected in Kohelet. Not using the same language necessarily, but when you recognize that, maybe Kohelet isn't so much the odd man out as we necessarily like to think he is. He's just more of a provocateur than we're comfortable with. you know.
Well, Dr. Smith, this has been great. Young adults watching, Dr. Smith and I, when we talk, we usually go 3 hours, and then our wives are clamoring for us to get back to the kids. But we're gonna end that here. And thank you so much for taking the time to sort of walk us through these themes of wisdom and suffering and joy. It's been truly a gift having you in my life, and I'm so glad to be able to share just a snippet of the wisdom that you've accumulated through your own studies, but also your life experience. And I hope young adults you watching have gleaned a lot from this conversation. So, Dr. Smith, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, hey, it's my great pleasure to just be given the opportunity to try to be helpful. So thank you very much for that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for watching this video from our Young Adults Ministry here at Reston Bible Church. We're really happy to be able to provide this message to you as a resource in your own discipleship journey. But we don't want this message or our ministry to get in the way of your own local church involvement. So let me encourage you from wherever you're watching to get plugged into a local church near you. And if you're in the Northern Virginia area and you're not plugged into a local church, come see us at RBC on a Sunday morning at either one of our 9 or 10:45 services. We'd love to meet you. We'd love to get you plugged in here at a local church. And we hope that you enjoyed this message.